Well, hello, my name's Rob Fisher. I own a company called Fisher Improvement Technologies, and we've spent the last 30 years helping individuals and organizations understand how and why people make mistakes, especially mistakes that could prove to be catastrophic. And there's really only three things you can do with a mistake or an error. You can prevent some, you can reduce their probability, or you can mitigate their consequences. It is as simple or as complex as that. So again, I'm Rob Fisher. I got my start in the Navy nuclear power program. I rode submarines. I was Special Operations, Special Forces Liaison, nuclear chemist, and a periscope photographer. Did that for about almost 10 years. Then when I got out of the Navy, I went into work at a nuclear power plant down in South Texas. And that power plant got in some trouble. And when it got in trouble, they kept being told that they had these things called human performance problems, but nobody knew what that was. So they gave us this book by a guy called James Reason. How many of y'all have heard of James Reason? Okay. So they gave me this book called Human Error, and they said, here, go make this work. So I was put on a team that was supposed to do the improvements and take us from basically worst to first, make us operationally excellent. And as we did that, as we translated the theories of human performance and human factors into the practical application, we got good at it. So then they started farming me out to other places. So now I was going to other utilities and other nuclear power plants and airlines and hospitals. And finally, my wife looked at me one day and said, I'm pretty sure they pay people to do this. And you can either do it for your family or you can do it for someone else. So started our first company in 1992, and there's been a version of Fisher Improvement Technologies ever since then. So I only say that because I wanted to give you a little bit of my background, but there's also a little bit of fit history. Again, we've been doing this almost 30 years now. Some of the important parts of this are we have trained all over the world. We've done this in over 25 countries, 12 languages. We have over 400,000 students that have gone through the process of learning human error reduction, human performance, human factors. And then a few years ago, we discovered that we have about 1.6 million data points on how different people get hurt with different personalities, or how we see and manage risk different. Is it reasonable to believe that different people with different personalities see and manage risk differently? What do y'all think? Is that a fair standard? I've got an hour. Is it a fair standard for me to ask the question, is it reasonable to believe, instead of trying to get you all the way from one place to another? Is that a fair standard? So that's what I'm going to use. I'll ask that question a lot, but I really just hope that you will take away some nuggets of information. So if you're taking notes, you may want to take down those nuggets. We can certainly talk about them after I'm done talking. But I want to ask, what do these two things have in common? A bumblebee and a hummingbird. What do they have in common? Anybody?
They fly.
They fly. Good. What else?
They make noise.
They make noise. Yeah.
They pollinate.
They pollinate. That's great. Here's another thing they have in common. Did you know they flew for almost 1 million years without us knowing how they did it? But then once we figured that out, within 100 years, actually within about 20 years, we built a machine that could lift over 100 times its own weight because we understood the physics behind it. So we have all of this time. That's the way human factors and human performance is. We've had all of this time as humans on this earth, but we've learned a lot more in the last 50 and 100 years than we ever knew before. So we're going to be like the development of this helicopter. And in order to do something like that, I just wanted to give you a couple of odd starts to my journey. The first one is, how many of y'all know somebody with a fiery personality? Anybody know somebody that's cool and calm as water? What about somebody that's very down to earth? Y'all know people like that? How many of y'all know somebody that's squirrel? Y'all know people like that? Mm-hmm. Okay. All of those personalities have existed, and we've known about those for probably 3,000 or 4,000 years. The Asian cultures have used those elements to understand how people see things differently. How many of y'all got kids? Anybody got more than one? How many of you, of the more than one, you've got one that's like you and another one that isn't?
Yes.
Right? And they have to be treated a little bit differently. I mean, I was having a conversation with my granddaughter last night, and she told me that 3 people in the last few months have said, people think I'm a lot like you, Papa. And I'm like, oh, that's a good thing. but then I think there's a generation between us. So it makes it different in how we deal with people. But we've actually learned more in the last 100 years about our personalities and personality diversity than we knew in the previous 1,000 generations. How are you using that in your safety management systems and quality management systems? How are you using, if we agreed that different people with different personalities see and manage risk differently, how are we dealing with that in our management systems? Or even are we? So a little bit of start of my journey. In the 1830s, my family owned about 3,000 acres in a place called Gwinnett, Georgia. How many of y'all know Gwinnett? Right, Atlanta, right? So we had about 3,000 acres, and one day in the summer of 1838, some people showed up and said, hey, we're gonna take a walk. So they said, pack a few bags, let's take a walk. And what they did was they marched us across the Trail of Tears, and when we got to Oklahoma, 5 of them made it. And one of those was my great-great-grandmother. And there was 3 legs of the family that made it. My great-great-grandmother actually wound up being raised by someone who wasn't her parents because they didn't make it. In those 3 legs, the first one created a guy that has an airport named after him. He's called Will Rogers. How many of y'all have heard of Will Rogers? That was one leg. Another leg created this guy that was, if you any football fans, Dallas Cowboy football fans in here? So a guy called Walt Garrison, he was in another one of those legs. And the third leg got me. So you can just see that those legs kind of created different things. But I think that our entrepreneurial spirit, our desire to create something that was bigger than ourselves started with my dad. He's 89 and still kicking. Lives in a retirement facility outside of Fort Worth. Great guy, but my entire adult life, he was trying to make things, trying to do things. But I think I really got my start in this human factors, human performance, human organizational performance thing when in 1975, our mother died as the direct result of a medical error. And I got to tell you, I was pissed. I was mad at the doctors, I was mad at the nurses, I was mad at the system, I was mad at everyone who killed my mother. How many of y'all have lost someone and have that feeling that it was someone else's fault and you just needed somebody to blame, okay? A lot of us have that in our life. So I don't know that that wasn't instilled in me back when I was 18 years old. So when it came around, we have to start trying to fix this human error challenge that I didn't latch onto it. But in any worthwhile journey, there are 4 elements that we have. The first one is you have to have explorers. Those are people out there on the edge. The challenge with explorers are they never see their families. They're out there finding things. Some of the things they find are good, some of the things they find are bad. But if they find something good, this group called pioneers says, okay, we're gonna go check this out. And they'll go to great lengths. They usually gather up their loved ones and they go to try to check this thing out. And they say, yeah, you know, we can make it here. I don't know about that. But they start establishing what can then be called settlers. Those are people that start to build the infrastructure around what you're doing. Whether it's an operational excellence journey, whether it's a human and organizational performance journey, whether it's a journey to discover a new land, the settlers start to build the infrastructure so that the residents can then live there. You have to understand that we have all of those elements. And you don't need to send people to go back to be an explorer or a pioneer. A lot of that work has been done in the operational excellence world and the human and organizational performance world. But that settler, building new infrastructure, building better infrastructure, and residents, how are we gonna most effectively use this for the masses? That's where we're at in the human and organizational performance or HOP journey. So I'm gonna give you 10 things about where we're at in this HOP journey. And I'm talking about the benchmarkable people, the people that are out there that are doing it right. What would you call that? The name passed me. Anybody got an idea for what I'm trying to say here? The industry standard for this, the place that people are using the practitioners. I'm going to give you 10 things. And the first one is that there used to be a need for systems thinking. We had to convince people that we needed systems thinking. But that's now turned to a culture of systems thinking. So when Deming came along in the 1940s, he had to convince people that a bad system will beat a good person every time. Some people bought it, some people didn't. But how many of y'all in your organization use Lean Six Sigma or lean manufacturing or all of those things that came from the father of quality, Deming? And then James Reason comes along to the late 80s, early 90s and says, we need to also think systemically about human factors and human performance, that next logical step. But then we said, okay, it's one thing to tell people about needing a system, it's another thing to tell them what system they ought to be thinking about. So in the early 1990s, we said, oh, we work in systems every day, but we don't talk to people about what system we work in. We think that if we go to aerospace, the system's different, or nuclear, the system's different, or a hospital, the system's different. So we had to create a collective system, and then we had to understand that different people with different personalities will treat that system differently. Does that make sense? That different people would see that system differently. So we've driven our understanding, this is number one, we've driven our understanding of risk and controls beyond where it used to be. In other words, we're looking at both systemic factors and performance factors. We drive that into pre-task briefs. Of all high-risk tasks, we look at those things differently. So you can kind of grade where you're at in your organization against this new industry standard for how we look at things and how we integrate things into our day-to-day. That's number one, need for systems thinking. When we created this task-based system, we said on any task at any time, everyone is surrounded by other people, programs, processes, work environment, organization, equipment. All those things are dynamic elements of a task. They all change, they all impact each other, they all impact the individual, and the individual impacts all of those things. That's the task-based system. Now, this task-based system is an interdependent system where that person is interacting with all of these elements. Does that make sense? So it doesn't matter whether you're at home, at work, or at play. It doesn't matter whether you're doing something related to quality, safety, effectiveness, efficiency, or productivity. This system can be looked at. From what we know today, if you were going to how many of y'all have had a kid that at some point they start to mow your yard or your garden? How many of y'all have had that? And at some point you want to turn this over. You've looked forward to this day for 14 years. Your entire child and adult life you've been mowing the yard, and now you're going to turn it over to somebody else. When you do that, you can either say, get her done, like our parents did, or you can say, you really need to watch out for that piece of equipment that spins at 3,000 RPM. That's why 1,000 people a year lose their fingers to lawnmowers. Those kids next door, they've never seen you have to work on a Saturday. So those people are going to create a work environment, they're going to tease you a little bit. How many of y'all have heard of distractions as an error trap? Okay? So if a distraction is an error trap, we can actually pre-warn that person that's going to be mowing the yard. Anybody have anybody in your family that likes the yard mowed a certain way? Yeah. So if they don't mow it that way, what are they going to get to do?
Mow it again.
They're going to need to mow it again, right? Because that person in the family wants to see those stripes go a certain way or like to see it done a certain way. If they just willy-nilly mow it like their personality may do, and you don't tell them what the process is, then someone in that organization, folks, aren't we using the task-based system to make sure that that risky task is done at a lower risk? Does that make sense? Would it be reasonable to communicate it to them in a way that they accept it? So I want you to try something here. We said it was reasonable to believe that different people with different personalities see and manage risk differently. There's two types of drivers, individual drivers and systemic drivers. The individual drivers, how many of y'all have heard of error traps? Right? The individual drivers are those error traps. Now, too many organizations, they try and collect and understand all these error traps, but you two can be sitting right next to each other. One of you didn't sleep well last night, one of you had a colicky baby, the other one got a good night's sleep, and the individual drivers are impacting you differently. We can't manage that as an organization. We can teach you what the traps look like, what they feel like, what they do to you, and what you can do about them. We can't manage them as an organization, so why are we collecting information on them? Why do I have 1,000 pieces of information on something I have no control or management over as an organization? But the systemic drivers, those are the things that we can manage. Those are the things under control or management of the organization. So if you think about those elements, then it is reasonable to believe that different people with different personalities see and manage this risk differently. So I'm going to try something here, and I just want you to yell out your personal answer. So people, programs, processes, working about organization equipment, I want you to think about those elements. I want you to think about your brain and which one you tend to see first.
People.
You got it? Well, hold on. You're a little bit early. So I don't want you to yell out the one that you think I want to hear. I want you to yell out the one that your brain naturally sees. Fair enough? Y'all got it? So at the count of 3, just yell out the one your brain sees first. 1, 2, 3.
Processes.
What'd you hear?
Processes.
Did you hear a little bit of everything? So you had people, you had processes, right? Do y'all think that it's reasonable to believe that that's what's happening out there in the field with people on a crew? So if we see risk naturally coming from one place, it means we have to be taught to see risk coming from where?
The other places.
From someplace else. In other words, we have an interdependent system where people need to be aware of and manage those personality tendencies as they interact with other people, programs, processes, work environment, organization. Does that make sense? So now we're using this systemic approach where we're telling people how to use a systemic approach instead of just telling you need to use a systems approach. You need to be smart about the system. We know more about the human brain, and we use the human brain more today than we did in the past. We pay more attention to the human brain. One of the ways that we do that is I actually wrote a book called Understanding Mental Models, and you can get it on Amazon. It's about the performance modes or the mental models we use to do tasks. There's not 6 billion of them. There's only 3, and we float in and out of them. But the most important one is called knowledge-based performance mode. It's when you don't know what you don't know. Here's our challenge. If you don't know what you don't know, how do you know? You don't. So we have to teach people, here's what it looks like, here's what it feels like. Here are the triggers that you are in knowledge-based performance mode where your error rate is 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. Let's go back to the personality tendencies again. I'm going to talk about 4 major personality types. Of those 4 major personality types, 2 of the 4 would see those error rates, 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, and say, 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, that's a 90% success rate. I'm going to do it. Now, does that people think they're doing something risky? No. They're doing what their brain is telling them to do. But the other 50% will say 1 in 2 to 1 in 10, I'm not doing some of the 50% error rate. Those 2 people can be standing right next to each other on a task. So when we teach this, we have to teach it at the 50% error rate. Error rate, not event rate. And then everyone will understand. Here's what it looks like. I'm going to give you a couple of freebies. When you see somebody scratching their head, scratching their chin, looking up, saying, I think, I believe, I'm pretty sure, I'm almost certain, those are triggers that you don't know what you don't know. There's a gap in your knowledge. And remember this, you can't think your way out of that. You have to get an outside source of information. Now, what will people tend to do when they get to that point? They'll tend to think their way out of it. And then justify why they're right. That's why this error rate works. Yeah?
Go back to your last slide. Does that tie more to what puts people in knowledge-based performance mode, the one before that? The systemic drivers or the individual drivers?
That's correct, yes. Right? Some of the individual drivers, vague guidance or overconfidence or infrequent or first-time task. Those put somebody in knowledge-based performance mode. Those would be individual drivers. And it may not be the same for the 3 of you. But the systemic drivers, the process may contain things that put you in knowledge-based performance mode when they think you're in rule-based. Is that answering your question?
Okay, thanks.
So the next thing that we've done to understand that our brain is a little bit different is we started paying a lot more attention to the socio-technical aspects of work. It's not just go out there, get the job done, and go do it. There's a bunch of social and technical aspects of work that we pay more attention to. How systems are engineered, how they're designed, how they work, how they play together. So we're paying more attention to that. And this is just me. I rarely hear a group of folks like you say, well, you know, I don't really believe in all that warm, fuzzy stuff. And then there's an any more after that. Because I got to tell you, that used to be the predominant feeling about human and organizational performance and human factors. But don't bring me into that warm and fuzzy stuff, I don't believe it. Now I say I don't hear that anymore. I spent some time at a facility a few weeks ago, and that was exactly what the senior leader said. And I think I kind of went numb for a minute. Because this isn't warm and fuzzy stuff, you figured that out, right? This is a systemic and logical approach to the next logical step in operational excellence. Doesn't have anything to do with being warm or being fuzzy. The next thing is we have understood that our personality tendencies have that element. So what I've done here is I've put a QR code that you can check your own personality tendencies. And if you put this Fit Special Premium code in, you'll get about a 30 or 40 page report on how your personality tendencies fit, so you can share that with other people. But we know the doer, socializer, thinker, and relator have different elements of being task-oriented and independent or people-oriented, being fast-paced or needing additional information to be good at it. We can now bake that into how we approach a task because your personalities may approach that task differently. How many of y'all had some people out there that they're just out on the edge? Some people call them cowboys, or they're just out there doing it and get her done. You've got other people that would say, hold on a minute, I don't think we know enough. And they have names for each other. But that's the way their brains process information. And then again, understanding the performance modes, skill-based, rule-based, and knowledge-based. Understanding system 1 and 2 things. Daniel Kahneman wrote a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow on how our brain works to process information. Our fast brain is our unconscious brain. Our slow brain is that conscious thought brain. Well, something already gets into that fast brain, the system 1 brain, it don't like to go to the other way. You have to drive it there. You can't just ask it to go there. So after the fact, we think that you should have moved something to that slow brain and thought it out, when your brain's already said, well, this is the way I'm doing it, I don't even have to think about it. And again, I wrote the book, Understanding Mental Models, to think about those things. The fourth thing is that we understand that it's leader engagement that drives improvement. So if your goal is operational excellence or a good culture, if you've got this outcome that you have out there, you can't just have the goal of, well, we're going to deploy human and organizational performance, or we're going to deploy human factors. That all starts with leader knowledge. The leaders have to learn different things so that they can then do different things. So leader knowledge is a direct drive to leader language and behaviors. And you can watch those things, are the leaders taking the things they know and turning it into actions and words. How many of y'all think it's reasonable to believe that your people actually see what a leader does and here's what a leader says? So when they're doing something different and saying something different, do you think that creates an outcome? Does that create an outcome 9 weeks down the road or that day? It's that day. I've never heard you do or say or think that way before, but it fits my mental model, so I'm going to pay attention to it. What we really want is the workers to change their language and behaviors, right? You talk to groups of leaders, if I could just get those people to follow procedures, if I could just get people to do this, if I could just get people to do that. What we don't understand is that is not a direct drive. It's actually a belt, and that belt is engagement. It is how a leader engages with the workforce. Now, if you want this to be an efficient machine, this represents your organization, you want that machine to be efficient and effective and safe, if that belt is too tight, what will it do to that machine? What do y'all think?
Burn it out.
Could burn it out. Good. What else?
Break the belt.
Could break the belt. If that belt is too loose, what could it do to the machine?
Make it inefficient.
Make it inefficient.
Slippage.
Get it slippage. In other words, what we think we're getting people to do ain't what we're getting people to do. So instead of looking at all of these different things, we have to teach leaders how to manage the belt of engagement based on their new knowledge, language, and behaviors, and then you start to get the better outcomes. Now, those better outcomes may be safety, productivity, efficiency, sustainability. They may be your new cultures or values or norms. So how many of y'all have seen organizations that the claim is they have these cultural problems that they need to fix? Oh, I got culture problems, it's a big ship, it takes a long time. Well, the reality is we need to work on that from the leader knowledge, language, and behaviors. That's where all performance improvement and operational excellence starts. Your next logical step, regardless of where you're at on the journey, is to change the leader knowledge, language, and behaviors to get better. So, I was sitting in, how many of y'all have heard of Sidney Dekker? Heard of Sidney Dekker, right? Pretty popular guy. I was sitting down in Brisbane with Sidney a few years ago, and he looked at me and he said, you know, Rob, we're paradigm shifters. Our job is to go into an organization and take them from where they're at to where they need to be sustainably excellent. That's our job. But in order to shift somebody's paradigm, you got to give them a paradigm more powerful than the one you're asking them to leave. That's what we've developed over time. Has a lot of what I've said made sense so far? So regardless of where you started, we can start inching that paradigm for leaders a little bit so they change their knowledge, language, and behavior. We give leaders the right tools, we give them the right processes, and they start using them. That proves that their paradigm is shifting. What do you think that does to the culture of an organization? Start to improve it. Does that take a long time, or is that happening right here in front of you? It's happening right here in front of you, right? Because culture changes one behavior at a time. And the behaviors that drive that change belong to who? The leaders. Then the workforce will follow along, and they will follow along really quick. So we've kind of eloquently mixed the science and research and logic, but if leaders don't change their paradigms, you're not going to change where the organization is going. I know people use that cliche quote, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That means the leaders have to change their paradigms, or those culture changes aren't going to happen. They're going to be the result of those leaders changing. Number 5, we've been given a gift of, how many of y'all have read Todd Conklin's 5 HOP principles? 5 principles of HOP, okay? So you read through that, and he kind of narrows things down to these 5 principles. Error is normal, a blame fixes nothing, response matters, systems drive behavior, and then learning is essential. I mean, if we just hit the back of our heads and nodded like this, could we all agree that those things are important? But the next logical step in that is we've advanced beyond the physics of safety. It's important to understand the physics of safety. We've got 100 years of that. We're actually now managing the prevention and mitigation through the performance hazards. The second thing is we don't believe that saying error is normal means normalizing error. Well, it's okay. Error is normal. You're okay. That's not what error is normal means. It means I've got definitions for it. I follow those definitions. We use those definitions every day. They're based on science, and we've got something to fall back on. We also know that these HOP principles were never about shifting blame. It was never about, it used to be you, and now it's me. So in the old days of human and organizational performance, we would get managers that would sit around a room, you'd do an 8-hour workshop, and at the end of it they go, okay, so let me get this straight. Yesterday it was the worker's fault and today it's mine. So that's what you got out of 8 hours of understanding these principles? But that was never what it was about. It's about understanding, just the characteristics of the trap and the systems. And it's easy to say blame fixes nothing. How many of y'all have heard of a blame culture? Anybody ever heard that term, blame culture? What if I was to tell you that maybe it's not a culture at all? What if blame is a human nature characteristic? So Dr. Reason wrote the book Human Error based on our ego. It can't be me, so it must be you. It's not my fault, so it must be That's the basis for him writing Human Error. But what if we could manage blame? So here's what I want you to try to do. If blame is a human nature characteristic, and we can manage our personal tendencies, I want you to just look at your wrist, and I want you to picture a pause and a play button on your non-dominant wrist. So just hold your wrist up and kind of look at it. To picture a pause button on there. Every time you want to blame somebody, I just want you to reach down and push that pause button. Every time you think you want to say something out of instinct or instant, or how many of y'all have heard of a knee-jerk reaction? Reach down and push that pause button. And I mean physically push it, because what that does, if you read Kahneman's work, is it connects your brain to your physicality. Slows your brain down to the speed at which your body can perform. So you reach down and push that pause button. You can now respond instead of react. How many of you think it would be better to respond than to react to something? Yeah.
That's difficult. Like when you go out to a place and you first understanding HOP, and you get to a place and they're talking about complacency of workers, and you go in, you start doing an actual analysis, and you realize the worker never had the right parts they needed in the first place. There was no oversight whatsoever. They're basically thrown out there to get it done because that's what they've always done. And then you start to really analyze it. It's really easy to fall into the trap to shifting blame. So you got to really understand that you got to push that pause button,
Right.
Because what you have to do is fix the system that those people are working.
And that lets your brain wait just long enough to realize you're going to look at the system instead of just looking at the individual. And that's just a several second process. So that fake pause button on your wrist gives you the opportunity to do that. If not, you're just going to react in system one. You're just going to react in your fast brain. So that's step one of shifting that, and understand we're not shifting blame. The sixth thing is we have now moved from just empowering people, we expect you to do something, to actually enabling people to do something. So there's a difference between telling someone that they need to do something and actually giving them the tools, as you were talking about, the tools and equipment and processes that they need to get it done accurately the same way over and over again, or in a consistent manner. So again, we have said in the oil and gas business, right, we had stop work authority. And we said, we don't understand it. We gave them stop work authority. And I like to share that I met this comedian once called Ron White. How many of y'all heard of the comedian Ron White? He tells this joke about getting thrown out of a bar in New York City and getting arrested. He says, they told me I had the right to remain silent, but I didn't have the ability. That's what stop work authority did. We transferred the right to the individuals, but in the moment, we may not have given them the characteristics, the capacity, the capability they needed to actually stop it. How many of you think it's reasonable to believe that different personalities treat needing to stop something a little bit differently? Right? Some people, they'll stop further along the line. Some people stop at the first link of a problem. Does that make sense? So now we have to say, if that's the case, if we know that, it has to be built into our system that we do those things differently. So we've moved from just using stop work authority to how do we make sure we're starting work safely? How do we make sure that we've talked about all of those things before we go into having to stop work? We've started creating stop criteria before the task. But in order to have that conversation, how many of y'all know people that don't like to speak up? See, some of y'all didn't even raise your hands. You don't like to speak up so much. You just nod your head. Those people have a little bit more trouble stopping work. They need a little more information before they'll stop, fair enough. So if we set it ahead of time, then we've got 2/3 of the problem licked when we get out there in the field. So are your people empowered to stop work? What do y'all think? How many of y'all have a process or have a rule that says, when you're not sure, you should stop and get help? How many of y'all have that? Okay? But are they enabled? Have we taught them what the traps, triggers, and tools look like and feel like? Have we taught them the system that they need to look at? Have we taught them about skill-based, rule-based, knowledge-based performance mode? Have we taught them the tools that they need to shift those mental models? Have we enabled them to do something about when they're unsure? In other words, who gets to define unsure in your organization? Who gets to define them?
Individuals.
with the individual. How good are we at that?
Not very.
Or do we tend to justify why we're right or justify that we know? I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Folks, this is a human nature characteristic. We get into a point. But if you knew that your probable error rate was closer to 1 in 2, would you then get help faster? If I told you your error rate was going to be as high as 50%, would you get help?
Yes.
But we're not using that in our safety management systems as a part of, or our quality management systems, as a part of us understanding that. So when you say, I want you to write down these letters, OOPPS, oops. When you discover you are outside of a procedure, program, process, parameter, or the situation as you expected it to be, that is when you're unsure. So now we've defined unsure for people. What do you think will happen to the number of times that they stop when they're unsure? Think it'll go up or down? It'll go up. That gives us time to deal with the risk before the risk hits us over here. Does that make sense to everybody? The next thing is, number 7, that we know that if leaders use models, processes, and tools, workers will too. Old human performance, old human organizational performance, old human factors was, let's give everything to the workers, wash our hands and say, those workers now have tools, they've got traps, they've got all of these things, we just expect them to use it to be better. And us leaders, we say, we have empowered them to do those things. And we expect them to do it. But what we know today is that leaders should understand the essential leadership cycle. They should be self and team aware and have shared vision values and create clear roles and processes. Those will then drive the elements of trust, diversity and inclusion, commitment, accountability. All those things are resultant conditions for good self and team awareness, good shared vision values, and clear roles and processes. We have to give them tools to understand that when someone deviates from a rule, standard, or expectation, that deviation is going to come within a probability. And we can understand and manage those probabilities, then we can analyze what the systemic drivers were and whether it was a violation or an error, and then what we're going to do about those things. But we're going to use a process to do that. We're not just going to use, if you go into an organization and you ask this first question, was a rule or procedure knowingly violated? What do most organizations say?
Yep. Yes.
They say yes. They just answer the question, not, well, let's figure that out. What's the probability? Well, probability is 90-10 the other way. So we ought to be advancing understanding that there's a systemically driven deviation, that we want to understand the systemic drivers instead of, he violated the rule. Right? We use that as a process. Here's the fantastic thing about deviation analysis. Doesn't matter who's doing it. Because at each question, there are methods to use to identify the answer to the question. It's not answer that question. It's use these techniques to answer that question. And our experience has been when an organization starts to use these, they start changing the leader knowledge, language, and behaviors like that. And then what does that do to the workforce who doesn't know from Shinola what you're about to do? They start seeing leader knowledge, language, and behaviors. What do you think that does to the engagement in the organization? It starts to go up. How many of you think it's reasonable to believe we get completely different information from that organization than we did a week ago? Okay?
And what I see that doing is actually building trust rather than demanding it.
Exactly. So this whole piece about the resulting conditions being developed, not demanded, becomes important. So I actually do a podcast called the Essential Leadership Cycle Podcast. I put the QR code up here. It's free. I've probably interviewed 60 senior leaders from around the world about how they use the Essential Leadership Cycle to manage all of these things that we've got going on and all the new things that we understand now that we didn't know 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I encourage you to, if you're a podcast listener, sign on to that. If you have a senior leader that likes podcasts but won't listen to you, have them listen to somebody else. Number 8 is a lot of people have save your life rules, life-saving rules, rules to love by or leave by, cardinal rules. They've created these. And there's this trend out there that says, well, you shouldn't do that. You need to get rid of those. I'm going to give you a little bit different perspective on that. Because we understand that by mischaracterizing some of these, that was the problem with having them, not having them. So I'd ask you a question. If you have life-saving rules, it's less about the violation of that rule than it is learning how we got somebody put in a position where they were outside that rule. Isn't that something you'd like to know? Because the next person that gets put outside of that, if they don't have the experience of the person that just did it, it's a life-saving rule. They could get hurt, maimed, or killed. The second piece is that when we have a whole bunch of different sets of rules, which one takes priority? Well, at the worker level, you've given them a procedure, and then over here in the background, you've got this set of life-saving rules. But those elements aren't contained in the procedure that they've got right in front of them. So what are they supposed to do? Do this step? Is that in the life-saving rule? Do this thing? Is that in the procedure? That confusion, that complexity sets people up for success or failure. What do you think? Which one? For failure. But we think the life-saving rules are there to set people up for success. So this life-saving or saving your life, the other thing about just the name is, doesn't life-saving imply you're already in trouble? In other words, you're in trouble, I'm going to throw you a lifesaver. But people aren't in trouble when you want them to use the life-saving rules. So this naming of life-saving rules, I don't care if that's what you name them. If that's what you want to name them, that's fine. You have to explain them differently. Because it's more about the procedure than the risk, and that's opposite. And the last thing is, a lot of people out there today are claiming that life-saving rules and save your life rules are bad. They're terrible. You shouldn't have them. It hurts more people than it helps. How many of y'all have heard people say that? Right? So they want to shift the narrative all over to that. Folks, I'm going to tell you, I think about this a little bit differently. Now, I've only worked in 400 organizations in 25 countries with over 400,000 students. So what I'm bringing to you is what we have seen out there. We put life-saving rules in place because of the blood of our brothers and sisters that were shed doing that task. So before you get rid of one of them, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back to the families of the people who died, got hurt, maimed, or killed. And I want you to tell them, yeah, you know, we didn't do this right. We told you we were going to fix it so nobody else got into trouble that your parent or brother or sister or father or mother or friend got into. We're going to throw those away and we're going to do it a little bit differently. How do you think that would land with the people that were touched by this person being hurt, maimed, or killed? Do you think they'd accept that? So here's what I'll tell you. If you want to throw your life-saving rules out the window, go for it. But you better go do that first. I want you to do it personally. Don't pawn it off on somebody else. You better damn well have something better than you got in place now. But what if we just managed them differently? Folks, these are the learnings of everything that we've done. We know what kills people. Hell, I sat on the board for the International Conference for Fatality and Serious Injury Elimination. We know what kills people. We've got to have some rules around those things. But we can treat them better. Treat those rules better instead of throwing them out and saying we're going to replace them with something else. Number 9 is, we understand, how many of y'all have heard of psychological safety? So this is just Rob. I'm 66 years old and I'm tired of chasing shiny objects. So psychological safety, safety culture, safety 1, safety 2, safety differently, hop differently. Whatever you want to call those things, the next term is psychological safety. Any of those things, what we need to think about is we need to develop those, not demand them. So what's the difference between developing something, creating it, and demanding it? Well, when it's demanded, we get told what to do. It's outcome based, and the accountability usually lies at the field. Okay? They didn't do what we said we were going to do, and even related to psychological safety, I saw that person treat that person wrong, therefore they weren't creating psychological safety. Think, well, hold on. What's systemically about what was going on created the conditions under which that conversation happened? Is that a systemic problem or an individual problem? What do y'all think?
Systemic.
How do we treat it? Like it's an individual problem. In other words, we expect the workers to make it happen. Once again, we're not using the engagement belt. We just think there's a direct drive between, all right, next year, our goal is to be psychologically safe. And we're going to look at the psychological safety attributes and boom, next year we're going to grade ourselves against psychological safety. Wait a minute, didn't we do that on safety culture and employee engagement 10 years ago? So if that worked 10 years ago, we would be way ahead of where we are now, fair enough? So now we have to do it differently. We have to develop it. We got to tell people this is how it's done. It's process-based. Accountability gets developed through the process instead of demanded. I'm demanding accountability. Now, again, this is just our experience. We have the benefit now of about probably 30% of the organizations that come to us today already being highly reliable or high performing. You know, they're at the top of their game and they want to stay there, as opposed to we're in trouble and we need to get better. When we go into those organizations, did you know we never hear them talk about accountability? We don't talk about it. Does that mean accountability doesn't exist? No. I'm accountable to you, you're accountable to me. We're accountable to each other. The system and organization are accountable to us. We're accountable to the system. That's how we do business in a sustainable way. Right? We've developed accountability. And I just want you to think about your organizations. In organizations that struggle with accountability, they talk about it all the time. And when they get in trouble, they bring in somebody at the top that's going to hold more people accountable. How's that working for us in industry? Yes, sir.
And the reality is, in those organizations where they talk about accountability all the time, it's a one-way street. It's
Sure.
only holding workers accountable, not leaders being held accountable to the things that they should be held accountable.
Yeah, and look, I deal solely with senior leaders. I don't get down to the workforce anymore. The leaders think their accountability comes from the shareholders, from the CEO. They think that they're being held accountable for things that the workers are actually in control of. So you can see if we don't develop that, if it's just demanded, that goes all the way up and down the chain. So you can use something called values-based engagement. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can go online and you can watch some videos on it. A method-based observation says I'm going to go out and I'm going to watch work. And then I'm going to document what I saw. How many of y'all have management observations, right? If I were to tell you, go back and tell me the top 5 things you learned and made changes in the organization from your observation program, how long would it take you to do that when you went back home? In other words, you got people slicing and dicing all this data that's coming in. I want you to consider going out and doing method-based or values-based engagements. We're going to have a conversation instead of an observation. I'm going to talk to you about why we do things instead of what we do. I'm going to use certain questioning techniques. You've probably heard people talk about asking better questions. How many of you have read about, we need to ask better questions, but then we don't tell people what kind of questions to ask. But the more you engage, as Michelle says, the more you start to uncover gaps in your culture. Well, remember, self and team awareness is number 1 on the essential leadership cycle. Shared vision and values is number 2. When we're talking about those things and we uncover the gaps and we fix them, all the rest of those things in that cycle come into play. They're developed, not demanded. So I want to share with you some techniques that you can start to use tomorrow. If you want to learn from a task, or you have a good catch, or you just want to go out and have a values-based conversation with somebody, I want you to use something called the 4 Ds. And I want you to ask these questions. What are we asking you to do today that's dumb? You don't even think we need to be doing it. What are we going to ask you to do on this task that's different than you thought it was going to be, or different than we told you it was going to be? I know you think something different than we told you or you thought it was going to be is a challenge in a task, certainly. Now we're going to get a little bit more deep. What are we asking you to do that's difficult, harder than you thought it was going to be? Harder to do, harder to remember, just physically more difficult. And then, how do we ask you to do something that is dangerous? Now, folks, I will tell you, there's a great book out there, 4Ds and Learning Teams. I recommend that you get it. One of the things that we've added to that is these need to be done in this order. Because if you start asking a couple of the different personalities about dangerous before you've got them talking about the things that are easy, you're not going to get that information. So let's talk about the dumb thing. We can have some fun with that. Let's talk about the different thing. You know, this is what I expect. That's an expectation question. Fair enough? Then it's difficult. Man, this isn't what I thought it was. I don't know I was going to have to squeeze in there to do it. I don't understand how they made it so that we can't get in there to fix it. That you keep getting mad at us for screwing it up when we can't even get in there to fix it. And then you can talk about the risk, the danger, serious injury and fatality potential. How many of y'all have SIF potential? And you look at it. Then we can have those conversations. So that's before something bad happens, we can have that conversation. After something bad happens, here's something I want you to try. Don't ask as a leader, don't ask why in the first 48 hours. How many of y'all have a process for analyzing causes that determines the why? Oh, thank you. I thought none of you. I said, oh boy, that's interesting. So you got a whole bunch of people that don't do incident analysis, but you do, right? You have a process to that. Why is a process question. What I want you to ask is, tell me what happened and how it happened. Explain to me the conditions under which it happened. Describe to me how this took place and show me where this or something like it could happen. Tell me, explain to me, describe to me, and show me. Those are called TEDS questions. How many of you think it's reasonable to believe you'll get the whys from asking those questions? When you ask somebody why, an individual, why they did something, what does the human brain do with that information? If I say, why did you do that? What's the human brain think?
You're being blamed.
I'm being blamed. They're looking for somebody to blame. It's me. So they're looking for somebody for their fault. Now if they've decided it's my fault, who's going to get punished?
Me.
I am. That may not even be the way you're approaching it. But that's the way the normal human takes that. If you don't believe it, try it with your kids. Why did you come in after midnight? As opposed to, tell me what happened. Explain to me the conditions. Describe to me what was going on. And show me what was difficult about coming in before midnight. How many of you think you get a completely different story from that than why did you come in after midnight? I told you to come in. Isn't that the same as sending somebody out on a task and they either do it or not do it the way you want them to? So the process of developing goes through 3 legs. The first one is education. We've got to teach people different things. The next one is integration. Those things that we've now learned need to be integrated into the day-to-day workflow. And the third one is sustainability. This is how we do business. So, education, leader knowledge, language, and behavior. Integration, our processes, our pre-task briefs, our lockout, tagout need to contain the attributes of human and organizational performance. Sustainability, the next round of people that comes in don't even know they're doing human and organizational performance because it's baked into how we do business.
Hey Rob, can
Yeah.
you go back? I kind of missed some notes on number 10 there. Can you go back one more slide, please?
Oh,
Missed number 10.
I didn't even realize that came about. So number 10
I was
is,
trying to do that correctly.
it's okay, this is the way it happens in real life too. Number 10 is we've got a more defined and holistic approach. In other words, we know the systems that create sustainable operational excellence. And it's not, we do one thing, right? It's we have the error mitigation and reduction strategies. We do better incident analysis. We've got better procedures, programs, and those are all created by this holistic approach to human and organizational performance. So you probably heard a lot of people say they do HOP and they tell you they do one thing, and that's HOP. And what everybody else does, that's not HOP. That's not true. HOP is a holistic approach to improving operational excellence. Thank you for doing that. I didn't realize it had gone beyond that. And that's where education, integration, sustainability come into play. This isn't difficult, but do y'all see that there's a process to follow? And there's people out there that have already done it. So if you want to create sustainable operational excellence, you use education, integration, and sustainability as the base. then your leaders and your workforce, they start to understand, they start to do things a little bit better and differently. What do you think that does to your organizational capacity and resilience? It starts to increase it. It starts to be the way we do business. We now have better capacity and resilience. Those have kind of become safety buzzwords, haven't they? But that's what we want to create. And then we've got sustainably improved performance. And sustainably improved performance is sustainable operational excellence.
So as I start to travel down this journey, but I'm still getting some recordables like dust in the eye and things like that, how do I get my team to stay focused on the capacity piece of this?
I don't want them focused on the capacity piece. I want them to go back to self-esteem, awareness, shared vision, values, clear rules, and processes. So I'm still having things I don't want. I then have to ask Ted's questions on how we got there. I need to understand, we didn't talk about the how bad things happen, but we know things happen in certain percentages. I don't know whether that's an isolated, so it's the way we look at those incidents. Are we asking the 4Ds and the Ted's questions about the tasks that those things happen on? Are we doing the processes that create this instead of trying to demand the outcomes? Does that make sense? So again, we're still going to focus down here on the essential leadership cycle and on deviation analysis. I don't know whether somebody got something in their eye because there was a deviation or whether, and this one really hits home for me, and it hits home for me because I've been told by my eye doctor I should wear glasses all the time just in case something gets in my good eye because I'm blind in my left eye. You should wear glasses all the time. I think, okay, I mean, that's one thing. And then he gives me this example of a guy that fell in his kitchen and hit his eye on the counter, and it pushed his eye back in, so now he's blind in both eyes. And I thought, you think wearing sunglasses would prevent that? So we have those rich discussions about that. That's in the process. That's a great question because, again, I don't want you focused on the outcomes. That's what these are. I want you focused on the process. And the processes are essential leadership cycle of this. Make sense?
Yep.
So let's revisit that gear model. We now know through models, processes, and tools, all of the different attributes that work in the gear model to produce these outcomes. You don't want those outcomes, right? We now know what those look like, how they work. There's a process for that. Again, we're back to, you have to learn from the people that have been the explorers and the pioneers, even some of the settlers. We know more about this stuff today. This is about creating your legacy, not creating ours. We've already been out there on that cutting edge. But you need to learn to use the knowledge of those folks to create your legacy. So just a couple more thoughts, and I'm going to be done. The first one is, you need to tell some stories. But I don't want you telling stories about outcome. Tell stories about process. When you tell stories about outcome, is it reasonable to believe that the workforce may think, yeah, but I would never do that, right? I would never leave a ground installed. I would never cut my finger off. When you tell a story about process, you bring people along a mental journey. The second thing is, well, what used to be approached as a program now needs to be approached as a passion. Somebody in your organization is going to be passionate about the outcome of operational excellence. Hopefully one of those is the people in this room. One of those is a senior leader who says, I know we need to develop that because I'm going to be gone one day and it needs to be sustainable. Or somebody in your organization. We develop advocates and what we call super advocates. We've got thousands of these folks around the world that they have a passion for this. And very, very rarely do they have to create a program for it because the passion then creates the processes that surround it. The next one is, your job is going to be to go home and translate this into some of the hows. I hope you took good mental or physical notes. I'm going to give you a copy of this presentation so you can go back through, but everything I talked about is in a 2 to 5 minute video online. So you'll have access to that. But in order to do some of the things, we've got to understand the personalities of the people that we're dealing with. So there's another session on how the different people see and manage risk differently. And the last thing is that in order to have change, in order to say we've learned something, then leader, knowledge, language, and behaviors have to change sustainably. How many of y'all have lessons learned documents that you send out? I'm not telling you not to send them out, but sometimes we send them out within a week of an event. We don't know what really needs to change. We haven't really learned anything. But when I get it out to her, She thinks we've learned it and it didn't impact her, so she doesn't have to do anything different. And then we have a repeat event, and then another repeat event. So we don't get it. We send out lessons learned on this. No. Lessons aren't learned. Learning doesn't happen until leader knowledge, language, and behaviors change. Folks, it's an absolute honor to be able to do something like this with you. Put a QR code up here for what we call Fit Online. We have over 300 pieces of content that are free. Everything I talked about today, if you want to thumb back through this and say, I want to learn more about performance modes, boom, go to Fit Online, look up the insights and performance modes, and you can watch a video on it. I've got a leader that doesn't get it. Boom, go online, intentional and practical applications, a hop right there. So here's what I'm going to offer to you. If you go to Fit Online, poke around in there, or get somebody in your organization to poke around in there, find one of the paid courses that you think would apply to your organization, email me and I'll gift you that course. So you can sample what it's like to understand this at a deeper level. I've got just a couple of minutes for questions or comments. Any questions for anybody? Does this make sense? I know I put a lot of stuff in an hour, but all of this stuff has things behind it. And you can grade yourself against where the 10 things that I talked about are in the industry standard, and the people that are out there benchmarkable. And then you can grade yourself against who those people are. It's been an honor to talk to you guys. I really appreciate it. I'll be around for some questions after the fact, and thank you very much.